Good afternoon. I'm Kermit Whitfield, a member of the CMC Board of Trustees and Director of Communications at United Way of Central Ohio. It's great to see everyone here today. Thanks for coming out in the snow. Today, CMC is pleased to present Community Trust, a crucial and timely conversation about our neighborhoods, our people, and the central importance of trust in our democracy. First, please help me thank the Puffin Foundation West, represented by Java and Mark Kittredge, for their support of this forum. We are so fortunate to have today's panel of distinguished leaders who represent a broad range of interests and perspectives in this conversation. Each of them lead organizations that deal with matters of trust on a daily basis, and they are uniquely well suited to discuss this topic, which is at the center of a compelling national debate. Please welcome, from the perspective of the community and neighborhoods, Bo Chilton, CEO of Impact Community Action. From the perspective of law enforcement and policing, Kim Jacobs, Chief of the Columbus Division of Police. From the perspective of the judiciary and the law, Carter Stewart, U.S. Attorney, Southern District of Ohio. And finally, our host and moderator, former State Senator Ray Miller, publisher of the Columbus African American. Ray, the podium is yours.
Thank you so much. First, as has been said, I'm a former politician, I'm a Baptist, and I'm a publisher of a newspaper. It's going to be very difficult for me to conform to the time constraints that have been given me of 2 to 3 minutes. But let me open this way. We have a very important topic that we're going to be addressing. The 3 words that popped out for me are trust, freedom, and democracy. Trust, freedom, and democracy. I tried during this period, Black History Month, to get around to all of the prisons. I speak at the colleges and universities and churches and organizations of various kinds, but I want to go around and talk with the men and women who are incarcerated in our prison system. So yesterday I was at Noble Correctional Institution. And at the back of the program was a poem that I had not seen before by Marie Evans. Marie Evans is a great poet from Toledo, Ohio. You might recall that she penned this poem about a Black woman, tall as a cypress, strong beyond all definition, assailed, impervious, indestructible. Look on her and be renewed. That poem was not on the program. That's your Black history lesson for today. But what was on the back of the program was a poem, and I'm only going to tell you what the first 6 sentences, 6 verses of the poem really speak to. It speak the truth to the people. That's relevant to our topic here today. Speak the truth to the people, Marie Evans says. Talk sense to the people. Free them with honesty. Free the people with love and courage for their being. Speak them the fantasy. Fantasy enslaves. It's a powerful poem. It goes on from there, but these 3 words, trust, freedom, and democracy. My first question to the panelists, and I'm going to start with Bo Chilton, only because I've known him longer than the others. He's considerably older than I am. I'm going to start with Bo Chilton on this question, and I'd like for each panelist to take the same question, and then we'll go from there. My question, Mr. Chilton, is what are the areas in your profession where there's a need for greater trust?
A need for greater trust. Well, first, let me say I'm grateful to be here. I want to thank my board members and my staff for being here from Impact Community Action, where our mission is to reduce poverty by providing hope-inspiring help and real opportunities for self-sufficiency. Our charge is to help lift people living in poverty out of poverty so that they can become self-sufficient. As we talk about a community trust, we talk about opportunity for all to thrive in our community. One of the things that we've realized of recent is that Columbus is a great place to live in terms of the unemployment rate, the opportunity for all families to thrive, but that is not the reality for all. One of the facts released just yesterday at a Columbus Foundation event that I attended was the notion that there is a 2.7% unemployment rate here in Columbus, which ranks us second amongst most of the metropolitan areas. However, for those living at 200% of poverty, that rate is much higher. It's 20%. In some neighborhoods in our community, that rate for African-American males, young African-American males, is as high as 50%. So the trust in terms of when we talk about what a great place Columbus is to live, it is, but where you stand depends on where you sit on that issue. And so oftentimes there are many people in our community who are left out of that American dream, that spirit of Columbus that all of us have come to appreciate. And so I think it is important that we have proactive measures to reestablish that trust. One of the things that we are clear on is that there is a skills gap. While the unemployment rate is low, we're losing jobs in the entry-level sector. So that means that there are skills that need to be developed so that all can participate fully in the economy. And we definitely have some ideas about how we can get there.
Excellent. Mr. Stewart?
Thank you. And again, it's a pleasure for me to be here as well, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here. Before I answer the question, though, I want to address something that I think is important. I've been in this position for 5 years, and my parents still think that I'm the Ohio Attorney General or that I'm the U.S. District Attorney. They don't understand what I do. So I just very briefly want to explain what I do. And I don't want to overpromise in terms of my comments here. It's hard for me to speak on behalf of the judiciary. I'll speak from my perspective, and I know we have Judge Beatty and probably some other judges here who can get involved later. But basically, I am the chief federal law enforcement officer for the bottom half of Ohio, the bottom 48 counties. So I'm responsible for enforcing federal law, both criminal law, civil law, and we also represent the government in civil cases if we're sued, or even in slip and fall cases, actually. So this is from the federal perspective. And when I think of the issue of trust, I immediately think of issues that we're seeing around the country, in Ferguson, in New York, in Ohio, in terms of distrust of law enforcement. And I want to emphasize that there are multifacets to that. It's not just black versus white. It's not just inner city versus outer city. Trust is an issue across the board. And we, in law enforcement, on the federal side, we cannot do our jobs unless there is trust of law enforcement. Unless people are willing to work with us, unless people are willing to report crimes, we can't actually come in and do an effective job enforcing. And the reason I say it cuts across multiple different areas is because we have the same issue in the business community. Cybercrime is a huge issue. And if businesses don't trust that we will come in and do the right thing, they're not going to report cybercrime. It's an issue with parents. One of the growing areas of crime relates to child exploitation and internet crime in terms of predators reaching out through the internet to touch kids. If parents don't trust what law enforcement can do to respond to those issues, they will not come to us with the problems. So this is a huge area for law enforcement, and the Attorney General, I work directly for Attorney General Eric Holder. He has made it a priority for us to rebuild that trust where it's been broken or to make it better where it exists. And to that end, there's been a sea change in how federal prosecutors have been told to do our jobs. And rather than sitting behind our desks and waiting for crimes to be reported and then working with law enforcement partners to investigate and prosecute those crimes, we have been tasked with getting out and going into the community, talking to groups, talking to religious leaders, talking to parents, talking to business leaders, so that they know who we are, so that we can build that trust and hopefully serve our communities better.
Chief Jacobs.
Thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today about this very important topic. One of the things that I would say right now we need more of with regard to trust in the people that I work with is I hope that our community can trust our intentions. You know, I sat on a lot of interviews of people that we intended to hire or maybe didn't hire, and every single one of them basically tells us that they want to join law enforcement to help people. And I believe them. So when I look at the people that are out there in uniform, that are investigating crimes, that are dealing with disputes and many other things, I know that their intentions are good, the majority. And I think it's the far majority. Every organization, every person makes mistakes. And we have people that make mistakes because we haven't hired any robots yet. But I believe that it's important that our community trusts our intentions, and our intentions are to do good. Our intentions are to do right. And we should start from there, I hope. I think if we can get to that trust, that our intentions are good, our actions don't always play out that way. And how do we effectively deal with those mistakes, errors, gaps? Then we can begin to really move beyond. But I think that's a matter of where do we trust our intentions. And I work with an awful lot of people that I love and respect for everything that they do. And so I think that's one of the things that I like to share with our community is that we're here for you, and I want you to believe it.
Okay, let's dig a little deeper. So, Mr. Chilton, you provided some shocking data, even to me, quite frankly. I had no idea that here in Columbus, those 200% of poverty might be 20% unemployed, and African-American males, 50%, as high as 50% unemployment in some neighborhoods. What is being done about that? When you talk about trust, in order for the people to trust you, they've got to see some specific actions being taken by our leaders, those who are here and others who are in leadership positions within our community.
Yeah. And I raise that issue because it's a matter of access to opportunity. So often when we look at the disparities in terms of who is incarcerated, and you see a large disparity in terms of African-American males. And then when we dig a little deeper and find out why those African-American males are being incarcerated, many of them, over 70%, are drug-related. And so when we talk about access to opportunity and the ability to be able to provide for oneself and for one's family, that's one of the underlying issues that we have to get to in terms of one of the things that I've often heard and I appreciate. They said the best social service program we can have is a person with a good job. So that has to be at the heart of what we're trying to do. In terms of this trust, I will say that I sought to give a perspective that went beyond my own. Certainly, I have my perspective, and as an African-American male who's 43 years old, who has a professional job, my engagement with police and the community has been a positive one, quite honestly. But I did also seek out other community leaders to kind of get a feel for what's going on in the community and how do we really begin to build bridges, because I think we all do want the same thing. I will tell you, Chief Jacobs, you have a lot of goodwill in the community from my perspective. The people that I talk to, it's anecdotal, but I think people trust that you want to do the right thing, and I think that there is a level of trust that we have here in this community. I'm glad that we're being proactive in trying to set up some forums so that we never have the kinds of incidents that we've heard from around the country in Ferguson, in Cleveland, in Beaver Creek, Ohio. And so one of the things I'm very proud of is that someone who works very closely with us, Dr. Lewis Dodley, will actually be leading and facilitating some community forums with the community in concert with Chief Jacobs. And I think those are important steps. But there are some things that concerns that have been raised and some issues I think that people want to see in terms of how do we increase the communication, how do we make sure that we have that kind of trust. And I've talked to leaders from the Columbus area integrated health systems. James Ragland serves as the chair of that, they've had a number of community forums. They've particularly looked at how do we engage with people who have mental health issues. And it's a two-way street. How do the police engage people with mental health issues, and how do people with mental health issues, how do we make sure that we're engaging in the police so that it doesn't become adversarial? So he had a lot of positive things to say. I reached out to Jonathan Beard from the Columbus Action Network. They have a set of 10 recommendations in terms of police reform and their agenda. One of which is, and I know that you may get to this, Senator Miller, is the idea of a civilian review board. I know that's met with some mixed emotions, but I think it's an important conversation to have. Also, the requirement of all officers wearing body cameras and making sure that all of the cameras are installed in the dashboards of the cars. And I know that some of these steps are being taken, and so part of that is working with our police department. So it's a two-way street so that we understand what is being done and all of the great things that are being pushed forward. And then all of the ways in which we can engage with the police to better understand. Lastly, I'll just mention one of the things that I think that we've done that's been very proactive and positive. My good friend Corey Leffridge leads the APPS program, which is a program working with gang intervention. Gangs are one of the primary causes for a lot of violent type of crime. And so for us to have a proactive intervention strategy where we're working with people who have built trust in the community and can de-escalate situations, I think is a very positive practice, a best practice here in Columbus that I think can be more broadly implemented.
Okay. I'm going to come back to the Civilian Review Board, but Carter's anxious to jump right in here now.
Thank you. I just wanted to touch on something that Bo mentioned about the connection between unemployment and a criminal record. It cannot be understated the damage that a record can do to somebody who's applying for a job. Even if you're applying for to be a fry maker at McDonald's, there will be a box that will say, "Have you ever been arrested or convicted of a crime?" And if you check that box, it makes your ability to get that job much more complicated. And that's why one of the initiatives that DOJ has come up with is to help people re-enter society so that after they've served time or after they have a record, they get job training, they get encouragement and support to make them employable again. But this issue of trust goes both ways. It's not just trust of law enforcement. We also need employers to trust that people who have records can be good employees. So that is something that the Chamber of Commerce can help with. That's something that business owners can help with. And it's important to be able to show that it's not just law enforcement trying to help people come out of prison and become productive citizens, but it's also coming from the private community, because that goes a long way towards making the community safer and also giving people hope to stay on the right path.
Chief, the Columbus Dispatch, and I don't typically quote the Columbus Dispatch, but the Columbus Dispatch, oftentimes they do excellent work, excellent journalism, good investigations. So on Monday, this past Monday, the 16th, there's a front page article that goes over, and quite lengthy, that's focused on deadly force. I'm certain that you read it. Then I read an editorial, actually an op-ed today, on a speech that had been given by the FBI director, and I know that you read that as well. A very candid, very frank speech that he gave at Georgetown University about how white officers might see African Americans through a different lens. And I'm not going to quote him throughout this. It would take your time, and I don't want to take any of your time. But is there a need for a civilian review board? Is there a need for something external to the police department to actually look at potential misconduct on the part of police officers?
I would say that's not for me to decide. I would say it's for our politicians and our community to discuss and decide for themselves. I work at your pleasure to a large degree. I don't dictate to you how we are supervised, led, managed. I am led by civilians. I have a safety director that is my boss. He's a civilian. And I have a mayor that is a civilian that is my boss, and city council. I report to them, and they tell me what to do. And then I implement those things that I think need to be done to lead the organization. So that's a discussion, I believe, that needs to be had. I think research is important because there are different models for governance, if you would, on how those types of review boards or advisory groups, there are the gamut from advisory to investigative. And some of the more intensive things, if you get into the investigative part, then you're probably going to have to talk to the police union about some of those issues. But certainly in Ohio, we have open records, so our records are open to everyone. And I encourage people to get familiar. All of those records that the dispatch talked about are public records. So therefore, they had access to them, and anybody in this room has access to them. So if you're interested in whether or not we're doing a good job, that information's available. And then it's a matter of, do you want to get educated on how we are supposed to do our job, what governs how we do our job with regard to case law, with regard to policies and procedures, and then be another entity that decides whether or not we're on the right track. I can tell you that we always are striving for best practices, and if our city decides that it's a best practice to have some type of other civilian review than we already have, then certainly that is what we will do.
There was a response, Chief, in the article by someone other than you that said the same thing that you just said, actually, that there is a civilian review because there's a mayor, there's a city council, and there's a safety director. Is that a formal role, or are you simply saying because there's a mayor, because there's a safety director and a city council, then there's some oversight? Is it formal in the process when we're looking at any potential wrongdoing?
I take direction from them.
Okay.
They tell me what my budget is. I don't tell them.
Okay.
So they manage things. They decide how much staff I will have. If they think that something needs to be done differently, then we have a conversation. Certainly, I don't think that they review all of the investigative packets of our complaints and our deadly force situations and make decisions for themselves on those particular things, because they know that there's a lot more to it than just reading the package. You have to understand the training, you have to understand the case law, you have to understand a lot of the different things that go into why we do what we do. But no, I don't think that it's we do have civilian leadership.
Sure. It just kind of brings you right back to the FBI director's frankness and courage in making the statements that he did. Oftentimes in America, we don't want to talk about race at all, and so he certainly did the right thing by bringing it right up front. Carter, Stewart, DA, is there a need for the media to be more responsible in reporting what's taking place in your particular area?
But U.S.
I
Attorney,
just
not DA,
complimented
US
the
Attorney.
dispatch.
I think it's almost a knee-jerk reaction for both elected and appointed folks to blame the media for creating hysteria. And like all things, I think there's a middle road. I think that media is crucial in terms of highlighting issues and flaws in the criminal justice system in particular, and that change would not have occurred but for media attention. But I also see that there can be an overemphasis on the bad or the violent or things that media folks think will get attention either on the evening news or in newspapers, and that can have a detrimental result. Many of the tragedies that we've heard about across the country and that we've seen resulted not because the police happened upon somebody, but because somebody called the police and called 911 and said, I see this problem, there's an issue. The most recent example I can give happened in Alabama recently. There was an Indian national walking in a predominantly white neighborhood, and somebody called the police and said there's a dark-skinned man who looks suspicious, and that led to that gentleman being thrown to the ground and injured in such a way by the police that he's now paralyzed. But it's the paranoia that creates or that can lead people to call and instigate some of these situations. And of course, we want law enforcement to respond to all of those calls, but we don't want an environment where everybody is looking over their shoulder or looking at their neighbor or looking at somebody who looks different from them and assumes the worst. So I think the media does play a role, but I also think that the media has a tremendous positive impact on the issue as well.
Mr. Chilton, Thomas Jefferson said, we hold these truths, right? When he wrote that preamble to the Declaration, he said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that chief amongst these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Yes. As we're talking about trust, there are people who know that Thomas Jefferson wasn't quite doing the right thing when he wrote those words. Right. Thomas Jefferson had slaves. Thomas Jefferson was 37 and had a 14-year-old that he had a relationship with. There are people who know that oftentimes those in leadership positions aren't being honest, aren't being truthful. What do we need to do to address this issue of trust? If we're talking about trust, there are people who believe that there's great distrust. Yes. And so what are the areas that you think we need to focus on?
Sure. So one of the things that we need to take a look at, I was reading an article from the Sentencing Project, and it gave some information about the lifetime likelihood of imprisonment. If you are a white woman, the lifetime likelihood of imprisonment is 1 in 111. If you are a Latina woman, it's 1 in 45. A black woman, it's 1 in 18. If you are a white man, it is 1 in 17. A Latino man, 1 in 6. And if you're a black man, 1 in 3. We have to understand how that this isn't just an anecdotal, my personal experience, but this is systemic, that there is something undergirding this in terms of how, as an African-American man who has a 1 in 3 likelihood of being in prison, how then I'm going to view law enforcement and how law enforcement may view me. As I said, being an African-American man who is 43 in a professional position, my interactions are much different. When I'm stopped by the police, they're, how are you doing, Mr. Chilton? You seem to be in a rush. What's the hurry? And I'm like, well, sir, and so it's a very collegial interaction. That wasn't necessarily my experience at 21. That was not my experience, and that is not the experience of so many young African-American males who are viewed as a threat. And so what we're seeing is that, again, I said, where you stand depends on where you sit. Where you're positioned and how you interact based on your personal experience may be very different than those who sit in a different position. So I think it's important for us to have not only diversity training, racial bias training, but immersion experiences. Immersion experiences, that's where you build relationships. There's something that we talk about here in Columbus that I believe to be very true, and we talk about the Columbus way. And what that really gets to the heart of is that it's about relationships. It's about how do we build connections and relationships, and that's very important here in Columbus. Many who have come from other places who don't understand that do not fare well because they do not understand the Columbus way. And so I think it's important that we have those relationships. So one of the things that I would like to see, and we have a policy which I believe is correct, and I never want us to venture away from it. Right now, our policy is that a police officer cannot live more than, they have to live in one of the 5 contiguous counties here to Franklin County. There was a move at one point to expand that to a second tier. That creates a problem for a number of reasons. One, the emergency response time, if there is a situation and people need to be calling. 2, we want to have police that live in our community, that have relationships. And so one of the things that I know that James Ragland has proposed as in his candidacy, and I like this idea, is taking some of the land bank properties that we have and incentivizing some of our police officers or fire, public safety, to rebuild those homes and to give them a discounted rate so that they can live in our communities and we can have relationships, because at the end of the day, it's about being immersed in understanding that we're all people with different experiences, different ideas, but at the end of the day, we all want the same thing.
Excellent, excellent. I wanted to get to solutions, and you went straight to one of them. What about the need for racial profiling law?
A racial profiling law, I think that needs to be reviewed by a panel. I would like to see a more comprehensive study of the intersection of race and poverty in terms of our incarceration rates. When I talked about certain neighborhoods of African American males where the unemployment rate can be as high as 50%, then we have to look at, well, how does that impact crime? And what can we do to be more proactive in targeting those specific neighborhoods with initiatives that are going to provide opportunity? Again, Columbus is a great place. We have a lot of great initiatives. My Brother's Keeper is one of them, the APPS program. I think that we need to build on that. And to Chief Jacobs' point, I think it's important that the community become more informed about what we are proactively doing instead of making assumptions and being part of the solution. So it's a two-way street. Community leaders and individuals need to be part of that solution.
How can we develop a closer relationship, a greater level of trust with the community and the police department?
I think we need to look for the opportunities where we can engage with each other. Attend the community forums. The first one is next Monday, and then it's the following Monday and Thursday, and the following Monday and Thursday. They'll be on our Facebook page, they will be on our Twitter account, and various other publications, to look for those opportunities to be with us, and then give us opportunities to be with you. And we build relationships when we're together, not when we're dealing with pieces of paper, and not when we're talking from a distance or various other things. We build them when we're together and can actually sit down and have a conversation, and clarify some things and do things. And in Columbus, it is against the law to racial profile. We have an anti-discrimination law, so it is against the law, and we have policies, strong policies against that. So, but it truly is opportunities. We have an officer assigned to every single precinct. We have 20 different officers that take care of their geographic area, and they go to every community meeting that is requested of them. And then in addition to those, we have people that go out and speak. We have training programs. We have ABCs of policing to teach people how we use force and how it can, how we're trained. And then it's just having conversations on the sidewalk, you know, not turning away from each other, but turning towards each other and saying, hi, how you doing? You know, what's going on today? And being pleasant, you know, and smiling. And that's one of the things that I have to keep talking to my people. They get focused, you know, they're you know, going from a call to here to call to there, and it might be, you know, 1 minute taking an accident report, and the next it might be a robbery situation. So they get a little bit focused, and sometimes they forget that smile goes a long ways towards, you know, making it a better interaction. In addition to that, we need to always talk about, you know, what they just did with those people that they might have interacted with, because a lot of people don't understand why we had to sit there for an hour taking a piece of paper or, you know, report on the computer in the car. So it's just an educational process. Anybody, anytime can come out and ride along with an officer and be behind the dashboard and see what the officer can see and do and hear and all the things that are going on, and be in a roll call and see what we're talking about. I think those are ways to engage. And it takes time, it takes effort. You know, we've got a Citizen Police Academy that we put on and have since 1993. And I would encourage all of you to sign up for it, because we invite you into our facilities. It's a 3-hour, one night a week for 8 or 9 weeks, and we do that at least twice a year, and if the demand is higher, we'll do it more often. But you can come be with us and find out about 911. You can find out about SWAT. You can find out about what military equipment we do have, if you want to call it that, and just learn a lot.
Let me switch to education really quickly. I know, Carter, you have, and if you're as good as they tell me you are, you'll weave whatever you're thinking into this question. Education. We don't have anybody really to address education on this panel, but I know you're all well aware of the education issues. So we had a levy that was on the ballot. It went down 70-30. That would be a lack of trust on the part of the community. What do we need to do to ensure that would probably be next year sometime that we're going to have to put another levy on the ballot to fund our education system? what happened, number one, and what do we need to do to ensure that the public has greater trust in our public school system to support that kind of levy for our children?
Is that to me? Wow. Okay, we'll talk about a change of subject. I cannot speak with great authority as to what happened. I am a former high school teacher and care deeply about education, and I think the best answer I can give to that issue is that people won't vote for something unless they fully understand it, if they think that you're doing a good job to begin with and they know where the money is going. So I think that if there is perhaps better outreach and explanation as to what the issues are, how the current money is being spent, and where this new money will be going and why it's so critical, that may go a long way towards the success the next go around. And that goes to what my point was going to be about solutions to trust generally, which is transparency, explanation, outreach, all of that, just as it would be critical to passing a school levy, is critical to addressing the issues of trust with law enforcement. And I can't agree enough with what the chief said about just even a different demeanor. If any of you are familiar with my wife's work, you know that she is highly critical of the criminal justice system. Earlier today, she was in a car accident, and thankfully she was okay, and the two other people were okay as well. But the police officer who responded to the scene apparently was the friendliest guy in the world, because my wife could not stop raving about the police officer and saying great kinds of things. So that face-to-face contact matters. But I would argue, or one could argue, that those types of solutions, training, being friendlier, those types of things could be tinkering around the edges. And as Bo mentioned, some people support systemic change. And I can't advocate for this because it's not my role, but systemic change begins with laws being changed. And for example, racial profiling, I can't speak in Columbus, but in California, it's also against the law to racially profile, but proving that is difficult because the law says it takes more than statistics. You have to show intent. So even if 90% of the people who are stopped while driving are black and brown, that fact alone is not enough to show that there's been a violation. You actually have to show specific intent to prove the violation. So in terms of systemic change, there needs to be changes in the legal system to bring that about.
Let me say this before we go to you, Bo. In a few minutes, we're going to move to questions from the audience. So we want you to start thinking about the questions that you have, and then we're going to have these last two responses on this issue of education. I'm so tempted to ask questions about health disparities as well, because right in my view here is Dr. Teresa Long, and I know a number of people have been addressing issues of infant mortality, issues of diabetes. 43203, the east side of Columbus, has the highest rate of diabetes in the United States of America, not in Ohio, but in the country in 43203. So we've got critical issues that we need to deal with in the health area as well. But let's stay with education. Start thinking about your questions. We're going to move pretty quickly from this point forward.
Sure. And if you do want to learn more about health disparities, come to the forum next week where they will be talking about food deserts. And I'm sure health disparities will come up as part of that conversation. Just wanted to pick up on one thing Chief Jacobs alluded to, the community forums, and that first one will take place February 23rd at First Church at 3480 Refugee Road from 6 to 8 o'clock. Our very own Dr. Dolly will be facilitating that. So I would encourage everyone to be part of the solution by attending that community forum or one of the other four that are planned. In terms of possible solutions or what went wrong with the education and the levy, we would need a whole nother forum to unpack all of the issues that came up. But I can tell you, I served on the mayor's Columbus Education Commission. We issued a set of recommendations, one of which was the idea of a new public-private partnership that had access to levy dollars that could fund innovative solutions, particularly in the areas of charter schools, and that was met with some resistance. And I think Carter is right that our community did not fully understand it and therefore could not support it. I think that issue is something that he said, and it's my hope that we get at this with the community forums, is the issue of transparency. We can have different ideas about things, but we can come to a consensus and agreement if we feel like we understand where everyone is coming from. I think the distrust is when we felt like in the community, a number of people who even challenged me on my recommendations from the Columbus Education Commission, they felt like they weren't getting the whole story, that there was some hidden agenda. And as I explained to them where I agreed with the recommendations and where I had some disagreement, but I still supported them, then people could understand that. And so I think the importance of communication, transparency is important. I'd also like to see, as we talk about solutions, one of my concerns is that the workforce in public safety, both fire and police, remain diverse. I think that's an important piece so that we have those relationships internally and with the community who can be liaisons and bridge builders. My uncle Donald was a police officer. His presence alone helped to de-escalate a lot of situations. So he never had to really use force because his presence was the intimidator itself. But he was very effective at de-escalating situations. He had the respect. It's how he engaged, and I think it's important that not only do we have those immersion experiences where we build relationships, but that we have a diverse force. And I know that with retirement, that's been a challenge, and I think that's part of the community is we have to engage young people and encourage them to want to be a part of law enforcement.
Excellent. On the questions, please state your name and ask your questions. And we thank you in advance for avoiding long editorial comments. I certainly didn't need to tell the president that, but it's the tradition of CMC that we take questions at this point.
Thank you. Great conversation, great discussion. Thank you very much. Chief Jacobs, you and I talked just a few minutes ago. I think we would be very remiss not to ask you a question about your experience when you were asked to represent our city in a national task force this week. How did that happen? What were your impressions? You were asked to hold up the Columbus model, so you must be doing a lot of right things here. Tell us about it.
Well, thank you. I got an invitation just about 2 weeks ago, maybe a little bit longer than that, from the United States Department of Justice to attend the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. The President charged a fairly large committee, about 12 members, to go around the country and listen to various people talk on different subjects. Community trust was one of the big ones. Community policing was another. I was asked to come out and talk in Phoenix. They were moving around the country, specifically about supervisory management and leadership training. I found out that I was nominated to attend from the executive director of the Major City Chiefs Organization. Because of the size of Columbus, I get to be a part of an organization that is made up of about 70 chiefs from around the U.S., the UK, and Canada, who get together 3 times a year, and we talk about issues that affect large cities and urban policing. And I learn from them, and they learn from me, and we share ideas. We talk about the ongoing critical issues that are affecting policing. And I, being a female, I guess I stick out a little bit at that table because policing is 90% or around there male, and about 10, 11% female, and for chiefs that are female, it's 1 or 2% in the country. So because I speak my mind at that table, I got recognized by the executive director, and he invited me to come out there. And I just recently was at Capital University on a panel with the U.S. DOJ Cops Office Director, Mr. Ron Davis. So being present, I think, helps an awful lot with that. But Columbus has a large training academy. It's one of the best in the country. It's 166,000 square feet of training space. And people from around the country that come to visit that, including Taser International and Force Science Institute, come here and they fall in love with the facility. But it's the people inside that also make it great. So it was a wonderful opportunity. I had 5 minutes to testify, but I got to submit a 5-page written testimony, and so it would have taken probably 15 minutes to talk about. But specifically what our recommendations are for best practices in regard to training. And I think we do a lot of that ourselves internally, and we seek training from other, not only law enforcement training, but the non-traditional corporate training for leadership.
Okay, thank you. Next
I'm
question.
Carol Looper. Dozens of years ago, the U.S. Attorney, the police department, arrested many members of the Short North Posse. It was on its way to eradication. It was a gang. Drugs and violence were a big part. Here we go again. Within the past several months, members of the Short North Posse, a gang, drug issues, still searching for the head of it. What is being done in the face of all of the gang violence that is tied to the Short North Posse? Can this ever be eradicated? They aren't the same gang members that there were who were imprisoned back then. There are new ones. These people don't go to the forums. What can be done to eradicate these violent, drug-related gangs?
You're absolutely correct. We're on the third iteration of this gang in terms of prosecuting the gang. And I was not here for the first two, but I'm here for the third. And I can tell you, first of all, to answer your last question first, violent crime around the country has been going down for the last 20 or 30 years. So I feel that we in law enforcement have been making a difference. Obviously, it's not just law enforcement that's had an impact on that, but we can and will continue to make sure that that number goes down. In terms of the most recent iteration, the first two times that members of that gang were prosecuted, they were primarily the drug pushers. And this third go-around, we actually have focused on the most violent of those gang members. And so we have actually, in our indictment, charged over a dozen individuals with murder. It's the largest federal murder indictment in the history of the state. With murder charges, they face a much longer sentence than they would, potentially the death penalty. So this go-around, we think that we'll have a broader impact and put folks who need to be incarcerated away for longer. So it's something that I wish we could say this is absolutely it. There's never going to be another problem from the Short North Posse. But unfortunately, with each new generation, some folks who are the bad apples can influence the people coming behind them and continue bad practices. But I can say they have been significantly weakened, especially with this latest prosecution.
And I'll just add to that, as far as what CPD is trying to do. Within the past 6 months, I have taken officers out of jobs that I didn't think were as high a priority and created a second gang unit of 6 officers and a sergeant. And depending on the need, I will add more people to that particular unit. We already had a unit of 12 officers and a sergeant, and now we have 2 sergeants and 18 officers that are working on gang issues and gathering intelligence. And that is an issue also of community trust, is we need to have the information from our community about what's going on in their neighborhood with regard to gang behavior.
Next question. Marion.
Marion Harris, and actually I have 2 questions, and there's no one behind me, so I'll throw them both out. I'm sorry. How could I forget Laurel? Anyway, the first one is, given the lack of action on the part of the politicians in this country to deal with gun violence, what can be done on a local level to deal with the horrific gun violence that you can't pick up a paper without reading about someone getting killed, whether it's a teenager or a child or an adult, domestic violence, whatever. The second question was, how do you feel about the referendum on legalizing marijuana? So those are the gun violence is more important to me.
About gun violence. So, are there any experiences in other cities, in other states, and I know that there are, that you might want to reference in response to the question?
I can say that I don't think we can arrest our way out of the gun problem. I mean, they're too prevalent. My office every year prosecutes between 500 and 700 cases, period, criminal cases, and every single one of those could be a gun crime. There's so many people on the streets who are carrying them. So I think short of politicians doing something, the best programs that I've seen have been called SERVE programs, community initiatives to reduce violence. And those are programs that identify known gang members, known individuals who have committed violence in their neighborhoods, and basically been proactive about approaching them and saying, we know who you are, and we're putting you on notice that if you commit an act of violence, not only are you going to be punished for it, but your gang, your entire gang is going to be punished as well. And what we found is it's an incredibly small percentage of the population that is actually engaged in this violence. So if you can identify them and make them aware that you know who they are and you will hold them accountable, there have been demonstrable examples of gun violence going down because of that. It's been implemented in various cities around the country to different degrees of success, but I think that's one of the best models out there.
And I'll just add that we have a gun crimes unit that specifically follows where the guns are being used, how they're being used, who owns the guns, and what crimes they've been used in. So every single gun that comes into our possession gets checked for the, bullet, where have the bullets been found in other scenes of crimes, and whether or not the gun has been stolen, and if it's been stolen, and who's had that gun in the past as well. So we track a lot of those guns so that we can build a solid case on convictions. We test them for DNA to make sure that we can put that gun in somebody's hand. But that's one of the best practices that we feel is out there as well that we're following.
Okay. Going to have to move pretty quickly. Judge.
Good afternoon. I'm Laurel Beatty. I'm a judge here in the Franklin County Court of Common Pleas in the General Division. And I am interested in hearing you all's ideas on civic education. Because in my community activities, I have noticed that a lot of people aren't aware of what their rights are. So, for example, they don't know what a police officer can and cannot do when they're stopped. They also aren't necessarily aware of how the government works, so they might feel a little apathetic about voting. And then lastly, the last thing that they want to do is serve on a jury. Because they see that as, a waste of their time, because they don't necessarily understand the gravity that a juror has in our system.
I totally agree with you. Our educational programs are hard to get people to come to, and yet it's so very important. And so we have publications that talk about what you should do when you get pulled over by the police, and I know that other organizations have that type of information too, but it's extremely important. If anybody's ever looked at the citizenship test that our immigrants have to take, many of us in this room couldn't pass that test. I've taken it, and I passed it, but nonetheless, it's something that I believe that we need to continue to learn about how government works, because if you don't understand it, you often don't trust it.
I appreciate that question. We do have a program where we're trying to empower people in terms of their civic engagement. It's been narrowly focused, though, more on elected officials, the testifying at hearings. I think it does need to be expanded to include understanding how we have these relationships with law enforcement. And so I appreciate that. It's given us, I think, something to think about. I would also say we might want to consider, if it's hard to get people to the facility for the training, we may consider, if we have a group, bringing an officer to that group. Okay, that'd be great. So yeah, we'd love to be part of that. And again, we have that relationship with Dr. Dolly's facilitating those community forums, so let's make that connection.
Okay. We have time for one more question? Excellent.
Good
let me
afternoon.
just add, too, if I can, really quickly. Both Mr. Chilton and myself, we're engaged in leadership development, and you can talk to either one of us after the program about our respective leadership programs. Yes.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Raphael Davis Williams. I'm a civil rights attorney here in Columbus and also a member of the board of directors for the ACLU of Ohio. And my question is for Chief Jacobs. Earlier you mentioned trusting the intent of the police officers, and I wanted you to expand a bit more on that. Mr. Chilton mentioned a couple of statistics about those who are more likely to be incarcerated over the course of a lifetime. And the question is, outside of facilities, you said you have to remind your officers to smile or have a different demeanor. Are there any processes or programs in place specifically geared to improving the interpersonal relationship of the officers with the community that they're serving?
Yes, indeed. We do a number of trainings, if you would, but we also talk about core values. We talk about professionalism, respect, integrity, discipline, enthusiasm. So we talk about those core values all the time. They're part of the slides that we present when we do training in PowerPoint fashion. So we're always talking about that professionalism, what that looks like, and how it can be applied to that particular class, even if it's on first aid. How can respect be applied to that? In addition to that, we're doing implicit bias training. As Mr. Stewart said, we respond to calls far more frequently than we initiate calls. And one of the biggest examples of implicit bias, or maybe even racism, that I've seen is a scenario where a African American is doing the same thing that a white person is doing, and the citizens that are walking by are just totally implicit bias is saying there's something wrong here and it's okay over here, and it's just so wrong. So we need to educate our community too about the biases that they have and how they affect the phone calls that they make to us and various other things. But we do an awful lot of training on respect and professionalism and biases and how we can better serve our community.
Okay, we're right on schedule. Mr. Kermit Whitfield.
Thank you, Ray. I hope you enjoyed today's forum. We encourage you to continue the conversation in the lobby with coffee and cookies. Remember that you can view and share all of our forums on CTV, Columbus Television, on WOSU and PBS affiliates statewide through the Ohio channel, and anytime on CMC's website via YouTube. Once more, thanks to our sponsors, Puffin Foundation West, and thanks to our speakers, Kim Jacobs, Carter Stewart, Bo Chilton, Ray Miller, and thanks to all of you for being here today. We look forward to seeing you again at CMC soon.